Okay. Zoom slideshow. Okay. So Oswald began life in Venetia. Then he became king there, the era. But he began life in exile, and he was in exile in Iona, which is a great Christian center. In fact, it's Feast of St. Columba today. And Columba founded the monastery in Iona, and then he became a Christian there and was educated there. Then at the Battle of Heavenfield in 634, when he was 30, he recovered his kingdom and came back to Northumbria to the union of Deira and Venetia, and there reigned till 642. Then he was killed in battle, and in fact his head is in Cuthbert's coffin. When he was killed, his head and his hands were cut off and stuck up somewhere, barbaric custom, which was to make sure that he was really dead. And his head was one of the relics which was in Cuthbert's coffin. Oswald set about Christianizing Venetia and Deira, and he asked the people from Iona to send a bishop to Christianize them. The first person they sent was not successful. He was too harsh, and they didn't particularly like him. He was politely sent back to the beginning. And the next person sent was Aidan. And Aidan was given Lindisfarne as his center. And Lindisfarne became the chief see, the chief bishopric of the whole of the north of England. There was no archbishop in the north. There was an archbishop of Canterbury, but no one in the north. And the chief bishopric was Lindisfarne. And it has an island there. There you can see Lindisfarne, and opposite is the great castle of Bamburgh. And Oswald's castle. That's quite important. But it was a perfect place for a monastery and a missionary monastery. Here is the causeway going out to Lindisfarne. It's open at low tide, and at high tide, the tide comes in and covers the causeway, just pretty well up to the top of the poles. I'm told that a car gets stuck about once a month and has to be rescued. And then out here is the monastery at Lindisfarne. There's the island, and the monastery is on the southwestern corner. And there it is. This is a much later monastery, built on top of the original monastery. And the original monastery is quite big, much bigger than that, and takes up a lot of the land of the island. Another great advantage, firstly, it's so closely opposite Bamburgh. You can't see, but Bamburgh is there. I'll show you again. But one great advantage was it had a little island which is called Caddy's Island. That's almost covered at high tide, but not quite. And Cuthbert used to use this. The green bit where grass grows is never covered. The tide is coming in at the moment, and you can see that there's going to be some land left. Well, Aidan repaid the gift. I'm sorry about the dog. Here is Bamburgh Castle, a huge, great fortress. It was the first fortress ever to be taken by gunpowder, but it remained the seat of the kings of the north, Northumberland, right for many centuries. And one day, Aidan, who was meditating on the Caddy's island, Caddy hadn't got there yet, he saw a fire at Bamber, and the fire was beginning to engulf the castle. And one of his miracles was he prayed, and so the wind changed, and when the flames went out to sea and the castle was safe. And that's a nice story, I think, of the use of prayer. Now, we know very little about Aidan. We know more about Cuthbert. And there we're going to start. Here is Cuthbert praying at Aidan's tomb. The classicists can read there, whom from a disease, a paralysis. That's just part of the manuscript. There is Cuthbert praying at Aidan's tomb, and there's Cuthbert again, I think. Or is this the paralytic? Paralytic just means bedridden. And Cuthbert praying there. And the continuity is important, and it goes on growing and goes on much later. Now, what do we know about Cuthbert? It's a little bit difficult to know what we know, because the stories are told with reference to the Bible. So, for instance, Bede wrote 2 lives of Cuthbert, one a metrical like 1,000 lines of hexameters, like Virgil, and another one in prose rather later. The first one was written about 703, when Cuthbert had been dead for about 20 years, and the prose one was written rather later, in about 730. Now, Bede is a good historian, and he always gives his source. And for many of the stories, he gives his source as someone he knew personally, who went back to Cuthbert's own lifetime. I remember my first tutorial in ancient history at Oxford, and my tutor said, I want a reference for every fact you quote. Well, Bede is good at that, and he gives a reference for every fact he quotes. So some of these stories come from particular persons whom he names in his life. Others are rather trickier. So, for instance, there's a story about Cuthbert as a young man. A 3-year-old toddler flies into a fury and has paroxysms and has a tantrum, insisting that Cuthbert is going to be a bishop. Well, not particularly likely, a 3-year-old child, but this is a fulfillment of the psalm, out of the mouths of babes and sucklings, Psalm 8. So it's a prophecy put in biblical terms. It's a typical story that is told about someone who is going to turn out well. And then another story about Cuthbert. He arrived to become a monk on horseback with a spear. Odd way of arriving. But that's the spiritual armor, I think. He arrived clad as a knight of Christ. So all that's saying is that he arrived well prepared and ready, and he set about it and went well. He was greeted by the prior of Melrose. He became a monk at Melrose. Melrose up there in Scotland. He was greeted by the prior of Melrose, called Boyceville, or perhaps it's pronounced Basil, I'm not sure, who said, "Behold the servant of the Lord." Now that's very like the opening of the Gospel of John, when Jesus greets his disciples, when he says to Nathanael, "Behold the true Israelite." The boys will say, "Behold the servant of the Lord." Or again, when Cuthbert has a very bad knee, he's cured, and there's quite a to-do about cooking up a medicine, which is blessed. That, I think, is a reminiscence of the book of Tobit, when Tobit catches a fish and cooks the liver of the fish, and that cures his father's blindness. So many of the stories are biblical stories, and we can't be really sure what the content behind them is. Are they just saying that he's very saintly? And I think that that's quite possible, that comment on his saintliness rather than actual facts. Again, another story, he saw Bishop Aidan's, St. Aidan's soul going up to heaven when he was watching the sheep at night. And that's taken by some people to show that he was poor. Well, on the other hand, you can take the horse and the spear to show that he was rich. And I think they're both biblical stories. While shepherds watched their flocks by night, and there was he, like a shepherd, watching his flocks, and saw the soul of Aidan going up to heaven. So that's a difficult source. A third source of stories is the Irish tradition of peace with nature. Now, one story about Cuthbert is that he spent a whole night in the sea praying the Psalms. There he is praying the Psalms in the sea. And here he is when he came out, and the story is that 2 otters, or possibly 2 seals, appeared and warmed his feet. Lindisfarne is remarkable for its seal for 2 things. It has a lot of seals. It is the largest colony of seals in the British Isles, and it has a lot of birds that come and nest at the inner farm. That will come up to later. But anyway, this rather charming story of the 2 otters who came and licked his feet and snuggled at them, because his feet were pretty cold after the whole night in the sea. And there he is being welcomed back into the monastery. Another story, an eagle brings Cuthbert a whole salmon for food, and Cuthbert divides the salmon into 2 and says to the eagle, "There you are, you've given it to me, here's your half. It's important that you should have a meal too." Well, I think that stems from the story in the second book of Kings, when a raven brings food to the prophet Elisha. So again, that's a rather doubtful story. But there are some things which certainly are true. Here is the coherent story. He was born in 634, became a monk at Melrose. Was he armed? Well, I think that's the spiritual armor. He went with Aidan to found a monastery at Ripon. The king had given 30 hides of land. A hide is enough land to nourish a family for a year. So 30 hides is quite a large gift. And Aidan from Melrose took Cuthbert with him to found the monastery. And there Cuthbert was elected guest master. And again, the story, he welcomed one young man, and then went to fetch him some bread. And when he came back, the young man had gone. obviously, he was a young man. The young man was an angel. But that didn't last very long, because these two, Eata and Cuthbert, at that time belonged to the Celtic stream, and Wilfrid of Ripon was a Romanizer. There was a very strong link, and I think that's always worth remembering, a very strong link with Rome. Here is the Tiber. I took this is the bridge going over the Tiber. I took the photograph, and there is a hospital, which is called the Ospedale dei Sassi. It was a hostel for the Saxons, and they went backwards and forwards quite a lot. You can see the dome of St. Peter's in the distance. Well, Wilfrid went backwards and forwards several times to Rome, and increased the link with Rome. And then Augustine was sent in 597 to the south of England, and he introduced Roman customs, which didn't entirely agree with the Celtic customs. And they had to sort out what they were going to do at the Synod of Whitby in 664. And there's Whitby Abbey on the coast also. You can see the sea in the background. That introduces an interesting thing about Celtic Christianity. You're all male, but I imagine you do have some female members as well. Celtic Christianity had a lot of women in important positions, and there were several abbesses we know, and one of them, of course, was Hilda, who presided at the Synod of Whitby. She was the abbess of a double monastery, and they eventually sorted it out that the Roman customs would prevail. There were two matters which they quarreled about. One was the tonsure, how a monk has his hair cut, really. The tonsure, the Celtic tonsure, was shaving off the hair on the front of the head, whereas the Roman tonsure was a circular cut, which is what we normally see in pictures. My tonsure was provided by the Lord himself, who removed the hair at a certain age. Anyway, they came to agreement in the end, and that's a clear background. Eata and Cuthbert went back to Melrose, and from there they went on and came down to Lindisfarne. And here is something which we'll come up against later. The gospel, which was in Cuthbert's grave. I put that here because there's a very touching story of Cuthbert and Boysel, the prior of Melrose. When Boysel knew that he was about to die, he asked Cuthbert to read with him. He said he reckoned he had a final week, and Cuthbert and he read together 7 chapters of the Gospel of John. And here is the Gospel of John, beautifully written. That's called the Stonyhurst Gospel. But I'll say more about that later. One thing that impressed everyone was that when Cuthbert became bishop, he still remained in the monastery. He didn't have his own quarters, but he slept just like all the other monks there. Very scant belongings. St. Benedict says that the monks should not wear their knives at night. Oh, there are some useful tonsures. You see, these are the real tonsures, the Roman tonsures. And that's all they have, very minimal of clothing. And Benedict says that the abbot should inspect the beds frequently to see that monks don't have things secreted there. This is the dormitory of an current Irish monastery. And they don't actually use it any longer, but they did about 50 years ago, just like these monks here. And Cuthbert remained in the dormitory and didn't have his own quarters. When he became a bishop, he spent a lot of time going around various places and traveling up and down the country in mountainous forests and very rough places where no one would dare to go. There were no churches around, or very few. And instead of churches, they had a cross. This is one of the Celtic high crosses. It's in Moon in Ireland, where a friend of mine lives. And instead of having churches, they had a cross at the crossroads or something like that, where people would meet together. And that was the sign of somewhere where they could meet and pray. And there are records of someone being baptized at a cross or committing himself or herself to monastic life at one of these crosses. So there is a monument of Cuthbert's travels, but he couldn't stick it for too long. And after 2 years as a bishop, he retired again to the inner farm. And this is the inner farm with the birds that nest on it. The little birds are in the distance there. The inner farm is about 7 miles from Lindisfarne, and when Cuthbert died, it was signalled by flares burning on the inner farm, which signalled to Lindisfarne that he'd actually died. When he died quite early, quite young, and this starts the second half of what I want to say. He died, and he said he didn't want his body to fall into the hands of the heathen. Now, who was the heathen? There were constant raids on the coastal settlement from Danes and Saxons and Vikings, and they called them the Saxons on the whole. Didn't distinguish too much where they came from. Interestingly, it's the Scots word for English, Sassenachs. So the Scots call the English Saxons. Cuthbert didn't want, I'm going to move if I can. Yes, there is a sculpture of Cuthbert's coffin being carried by monks to escape the attacks of the Saxons. And he was carried around all over the place. Here you can see this is a pub called the Durham Ox. Well, you've got to trust me. Ox you can read perhaps. This is a crepe, which is about 5 miles from me now, 5 miles south. That was a mansio given to Cuthbert when he was made a bishop. It's on the way between Lindisfarne and York. We know of 2 mancios which were given to Cuthbert. One is Chesterley Street, which is just south of Durham, or really part of Durham now, I think. And the other is this creek. And they remained until very recently part of the diocese, the Anglican diocese of Durham, because they were given to Cuthbert as a as a sort of stopping place on the way. Why did Cuthbert die so young? I don't know, but he certainly didn't look after his health. In his final illness, he survived for 5 days on onions. Well, I don't know if onions are in fact health-giving in any way, but I suspect a diet entirely of onions is not good. And when his body was exhumed, it was exhumed several times. But the last time it was exhumed was in 1827. And all kinds of sores were discovered around his ankles. I'm afraid he only took off his boots once a year for the Maundy on Maundy Thursday, for the washing of the feet on Maundy Thursday. Not particularly healthy. And he had sores all around his ankles. He had ulcers all around his ankles. Anyway, he died, and then his body was taken off some years later, and the subsequent history of his body is, I think, as interesting as Cuthbert's story itself. Cuthbert died 687, aged 53. His body was preserved, but he was first exhumed for transfer 11 years later. They wanted to transfer him to a grander tomb. And they discovered the body was intact. And it was on his chest, it's a tiny little Gospel of John there. Here's the outside. It's the oldest bound book with the original binding on it. And as you see, it's in beautiful condition, with a sort of red leather, and here a typical Celtic design, which is Christ as the vine. Here is the vine and Christ, and then issuing in the 4 Gospels. You can see from the hand what the size of it. It's 12 centimeters high, and it traveled around quite a lot. It was taken out in 1539, when the shrine was destroyed, but preserved, and eventually it came to Stonyhurst, so it's called the Stonyhurst Gospel, and was sold at the British Museum for £9 million about 10 years ago. So there was the Gospel and also his Pectoral Cross. I'll talk about that later on. The Stonyhurst Gospel is said to have been written by Eadbert, who was the bishop after Cuthbert. It's written by one scribe. All this is done by one scribe. Most gospel books have several scribes. It's a very long process to write as beautifully as that. Usually it was done by several scribes, one for each gospel, say. But this is done with great devotion, and Eadbert, it says that he did it. Whether he did it himself or whether he had it made as bishop, I don't know, but it would have taken, any rate, a couple of years to do. And he was placed on Cuthbert's chest in 698 when he was reburied. The body was incorrupt. It wasn't mummified, but was it salted? They would certainly have known about salting fish and salting meat for use in the winter. Could have been a miracle, but not necessary. So there's the oldest gospel book the oldest book there is in Europe. Also associated with Cuthbert is the Lindisfarne Gospels. That's a little bit later than Cuthbert, but beautifully done. There are two great gospel books of this era, the Lindisfarne Gospels and the Book of Kells, which is in Dublin. And they each have a portrait of the evangelist, of each of the evangelists. Here, for Hagios Matthäus. Hagios is Greek. So there is a Greek model for this Latin gospel. It's Durham's Latin text. But it has, this picture must have a Greek model. Look at that. Here, this picture, exactly the same as the scribe sitting there writing. The idea of inspiration is an interesting one. Double sort of inspiration. Matthew is writing away, and this angel, the imago hominis, the image of a man, is trumpeting the message to him. And just to make quite sure that he gets it right, here's God the Father looking out from behind the curtain, just about to hand him the gospel. Interesting and not very exact view of the inspiration of the evangelists, the inspiration of Scripture. Another page is Luke. This is the first page of Luke. Quoniam, quidem. That's an M. Wouldn't fit. So it's turned round and put upright instead of flat. Quidem multi conati sunt. That C-O-N-A, again squashed in. One imagines that they must have known their gospel pretty well in order to be able to read, venerate to read aloud, if it was written out like this. But it's beautifully decorated, and you must remember that it wasn't a matter of just going down to the corner shop and getting another tube of ink. They used red lead, verdigris, and a lot of plant forms to get the different colors. And the whole thing is illustrated with such care, typical of the love of the countryside, the love of nature. These birds along the edge, another type of bird here, beautifully copied. Those are the headings. I showed you that this is another manuscript from the same stable, the same monastery. This is the Codex Amiatinus, which is an amazing, that's the book. It's been rebound, but there it is. It's just a little bit later, 10, 15 years later than the other Gospels, the other Gospel texts. And it needed, they did 3 copies of it, which would have needed 2,000 skins, calf skins. So in 692, they were given a land grant in order to get the 2,000 skins, to nourish the 2,000 skins. Then the abbot took it to Rome, set out to go to Rome, and he died in France at Langres. And it was taken from his luggage, disappeared, and was discovered again by Giovanni de Rossi, and there in Monastery Monte Amiata, and it's called the Codex Amiatinus. That's one copy. A second copy disappeared completely, And the third copy has some leaves of it in the British Library. But it's very like the Lindisfarne Gospels. Another fascinating thing about it is that while Cuthbert's body was being carried around, they stopped for over a century at Chesterley Street. And there the prior wrote in a translation: don't write books, don't write in books, at least not in ink. But when it happened 1200 years ago, then that's acceptable. This is the beginning of the Gospel of Luke. Expliquerunt Deuteronomy prefatio Justem. This is the end of Jerome's preface, and you see a very typical feature of these Celtic manuscripts: the birds' heads. Very often they get tangled up, and one bird is devouring another. Here the bird is grasping itself, really. And lots of lovely decoration. A great deal of use of the red dot as one of the characteristic features of these. And this is the oldest piece of English writing, God spell, which is the Old English Evangelia. The Latin of the Gospels is God spell, good spell, really. Spell means message, and they're all written in. To finish off, Cuthbert's wanderings, they started in 875 with the Danish invasions. They went to Craig, the Durham Ox pub, and then for a century they were at Chesterley Street. In 1104, the coffin was installed in the Cathedral of Durham. There's a story that the dun cow, which is the origin of Durham, came and saw, whereas if you look at Nico's picture behind him, there is up above there's the cathedral, and here is the river, which goes round, and it's a superbly defensive position. Well, when the cows who were leading the cortege, dragging the coffin, got to there, they froze and wouldn't move. And so this was a supernatural sign that the coffin was to be buried there. And so the cathedral was constructed, and here behind the choir screen is the shrine of St. Cuthbert. It seems to have been disturbed quite a lot. It was installed in 1104 in the new cathedral. Then in 1534, it was despoiled by the agents of Henry VIII. Henry VIII was closing down the monasteries, and Durham Cathedral was looked after by a monastery of monks led by a prior. And Henry VIII wanted the money, quite frankly. That's why he closed the monastery, why he despoiled the monasteries, and took a lot of valuable things from the shrine. What should they do with the body? Anyway, they opened it, and the report reads, the goldsmith did take a great forehammer of a smith, and did break open the chest. And when they had opened the chest, they found him lying whole and uncorrupt, with his face bare, and his beard as it were a fortnight's growth, and all his vestments upon him, as he was wont to say mass. even the vestments were fresh, safe, and not consumed. And then he was reburied there. There it remained until 1827, when a new coffin, it was exhumed again, and a new coffin made, and the old coffin, part of the old coffin, is a relic in the chaplaincy. Nico, did you manage to discover it?
I'm afraid I did not manage.
Would you like to see it now?
Yes, Father.
Yes, perfect.
So is it not in the Nordex? It's okay. Oh no, okay.
So this is the
Thank you
case.
very much.
I'm not sure if I can open the.
This is exciting.
Yeah, there we go. So these are fragments of Cuthbert's original coffin. Can everybody see those?
Fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Andrew. That's terrific. First time I've ever seen them. So he was put in a new coffin. And in 1899, I don't know why, but it was exhumed again. And it was examined by an anatomist called Dr. Selby Plummer, who said that there was a set of bones, there were quite a lot of bones. They'd obviously put in relics of other saints. We don't know what happened to Oswald's head, which had traveled to Durham with Cuthbert. But there were some hand bones as well. And Dr. Plummer examined the skeleton, and he reckoned that there was one complete set of bones which were a different color and different texture to the other bones found. And he reckoned that they were the bones of a man of considerable muscularity, he said, about 5'8" in height. And then put them back, and that still rests in the cathedral. So if you haven't been to see the shrine in the cathedral, it's behind the choir screen of the high altar, behind the high altar. So there we are. So go and say a prayer. Lastly, I'm going to shift you to the other side. Lastly, this is Cuthbert's Pectoral Cross. It's quite expensive. It was taken out at in the time of Henry VIII, and it's an obvious Celtic Anglo-Saxon piece of work. I put it there. I put there the Alfred jewel, which is in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, and you can see it's the same sort of technique. These gold things. The Alfred jewel is a lovely piece. It's a handle of a paper knife or something like that. Here is full of symbolism. Each of these arms has 12 stones, 12 apostles. And then in the center, the agate stones, the 5 of them, presumed as the 5 wounds of Christ. So that's, I forget what it is in the cathedral, but it's somewhere in Durham now. I wonder if Dorothea knows, or Andrew, where the Pectoral Cross is.
Is it in the cathedral treasury? They have an exhibition there of some of the treasures of the cathedral. I think it
Thank
might be
you.
there.
Treasures, yes.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Okay, well there we are. That's the story of Cuthbert and the story of his relics and why he's the patron of Durham and a worthy patron too. That's all I want to say. Would anyone like to ask questions? Nico is the question master.
I do have a question. Oh, well, Father Andrew has one first.
Well, it's a bit of a tricky question, Father Henry, and you may not want to answer it, but there is a legend that Cuthbert isn't really in his shrine, that he's buried elsewhere under the floor of Durham Cathedral, and the abbot or the monks of Ampleforth know where he is. Would you like to comment on that?
Yes, when I became a monk, I was told that, and there were two monks, said to be two monks who knew where it was, hidden somewhere in the rest of the cathedral. But I don't think it's never been tried out, and people don't talk about it any longer. So I think it's been dropped. But it's a lovely idea. It's really an anti-ecumenical idea. Yes, all right.
I see. I do have another question, Father. I read a book by Thomas Cahill called How the Irish Saved Civilization, about the mission of the Irish monks and the saints to Britain and Europe. And do you think this idea is too far-fetched? Or you say the Irish did save civilization through these missions?
I think there is enough. This is the text of the Stonyhurst Gospel, found on Cuthbert's chest next to his heart. There is, well, now you get a lot of formal writing in Ireland like this. The E is very much an Irish E, and other letters too. There's an awful lot of evidence all over the northwest, particularly, which suggests that there really was a mission from Ireland, Columba, and then the Book of Kells. Well, the Book of Kells, of course, it could be that the Book of Kells was written in Lindisfarne. An Irishman would slit your throat for saying that. But whether the Irish culture came from Lindisfarne or Lindisfarne came from the Irish culture is a disputed question. So it's an interesting view you quote, Nico. But I think it seems to me that the Irish influence is really there. But at the beginning, I showed how the stories grow with a sort of biblical background. So it's very difficult to be sure. Thank you. Good question.
Gail has the following question.
Yeah, thank you very much, Father, for this really interesting talk. I've prayed in front of St. Cuthbert's sort of shrine in the cathedral, but I connect to Bede I don't know, much more because he's the patron saint of students or because he was a historian, but how can a 21st century student in Durham relate to St. Cuthbert and engage with him more than just him being the one for whom the cathedral was built?
Yes, very important. And you mentioned St. Bede. I think it's thrilling that Bede and Cuthbert are brought together there. Bede, of course, is the opposite end of the cathedral, but I think his tomb is genuine too. Arx and in fossa Bedae venerabilis ossa, in this ditch of Bede's bones. Thank you for mentioning that and throwing them together. Very important that we should go and pray before the tomb, I think.
Absolutely. And also, Father, you mentioned the Synod of Whitby and how the Latin form of Christianity took over the Celtic one. And I wonder whether there still remains an influence of Celtic Christianity in the north of England in comparison to the southern part of England.
I think the two are combined. there is an enormous reverence. Everyone in the north of England, or in the northeast, knows about Cuthbert. And he's basically he's a Scot. He's Celtic, all right. But then all over the northeast, there are monasteries. It was a land of monks. I mean, there are 20 monasteries within 30 miles of Ampleforth. There's Chad and Said at Lastingham. Then there's another monastery at Fountains, Revo, Island. So the Celtic, I would say the monastic influence is very, very strong. And the Celtic influence is strong on the monasteries. I would put it as a sort of two-stage phenomenon. But yes, the Celtic influence remains, and the reverence for those manuscripts.
I believe Father Andrew has another question. No.
Yeah.
Oh, Gail, sorry.
I do have another question, Father, but it's not exactly related to your talk. It's kind of related, but you showed us pictures of the Gospels, and of course your biblical scholar. And I remember reading an article that you wrote in the Catholic Herald last year about the translation of the Bible, and how you're talking about how time changes and language changes. And I was just sort of wondering if that was sort of part of so when people sort of wrote those beautiful Gospels, was there a sense of sort of cultural appropriation at all, or was it just a modern idea?
The interest was there a modern idea of creation? No, not at all. People were perfectly happy to accept there was heaven up there, and although there's never been a time when there weren't people who recognized that the world was round, and it was well known the world went around the sun. It wasn't discovered by Galileo. It was well known long before then. And the Greeks, of course, even measured the circumference of the world to 24,000 miles, which is about 200 miles out. It was pretty exact. And that was done measured in Alexandria in about 200 BC. So they could have had it. I don't know how the relation between that scientific knowledge and the biblical knowledge worked out when people knew, when you had an astronomer like Galileo, how he put the two together. But it would be lovely to discover something Galileo wrote about interpreting the narrative of the creation. But I don't think such a thing exists. An interesting thing is that the Codex Amiatinus, I put there Cassiodorus' Pandect. The Latin Bible was kept in separate volumes. I think it's nine. And Cassiodorus in 550 was the first person to put them all together, to make a pandect, put them all together. And that was the first pandect, and the Codex Amiatinus is the second one, but both using Durham's text, which is probably the best text there is, best Latin text. Thank you. That's an interesting question, but I can't really answer.
Thank you, Father.
I do find it remarkable, Father. How did the Jesuits end up with St. Cuthbert Gospel?
I don't know.
He stole it.
The museum at Stonyhurst is a fantastic museum. It's recently been, I think last year, has been renewed, and it's beautifully kept. And it has a most amazing collection of important things. Well worth a visit. We probably didn't give it full value when you were there.
Absolutely. I think Simon has the next question.
Thank you, Father, for your talk. I was wondering, because I've read somewhere that in the first ages, or in the medieval period also, in the Christianity there was a conviction that when someone's body was incorrupted, that meant that this person is a saint. But I'm also wondering, because St. Cuthbert has also this kind of renown, and a lot of legends around arose around him, and I'm wondering which one ground for his canonization was the strongest. So this incorruption, or all this conviction in the society, in the community that he is a saint?
I don't think the incorruption is one of many stories. He was generally revered as a saint, and a lot of miracles and cures were attributed to him, to his prayers. And there was a very strong devotion to him. And there was people were convinced that he was a saint from the way he had lived, and his very courageous apostolate in the wilds of Northumberland. And I think I would think quite likely the incorruption of the body played one part, but I don't think it was necessarily the very important part. You mentioned canonization. There was no canonization at that time. It was just popular reverence, which made him a saint, as Bede was called venerable even during his lifetime. So it's one can't retrace the steps by which he became known as the saint. But I was so say incorruption played an important part, but not necessarily the only part in his being regarded as a saint. If it was somehow proved that he was salted as you salt a fish, and that the incorruption was natural, that wouldn't destroy his influence, it wouldn't destroy his reputation for sanctity. But it's not the only reason for it. Thank you. I think one should be skeptical, but not too skeptical.
Absolutely. I think Jake has another question.
It's not completely about Cuthbert, it's more about the cathedral. But I've noticed in Durham Cathedral that out of all the pillars, most of them have a zigzag, but one of them has a crosshatch on it. Is there a reason that this one certain pillar is marked differently to the other ones, like architecturally?
Well, I think there's quite a variety of patterns on the pillars. There's the chevrons, and I don't think it's just two. I think it's several. They're very like the pillars of the Knight's Hall in Acre, Saint Jean d'Arc in the Holy Land. Very typical of about 1100. And I think the pillars of the cathedral are the finest pillars in the world. And that's that.
if I can just ask, Father, I wonder why during the Reformation they allowed the body of St. Cuthbert to remain in the cathedral.
The shrine was destroyed, and they applied to the king to ask what to do with the body, and they didn't get a reply. And they just buried the body on the ground where the shrine had been. Perhaps the king wasn't interested, and the locals certainly. There's a very new book which just arrived with us yesterday, Claxton's Rights of Durham. Claxton, Andrew Claxton, I think it was it's the second half of the 16th century. So he was just alive during Henry VIII's reign, and he writes with immense reverence about Cuthbert. So there were a lot of people who revered Cuthbert. And I think they just quietly buried the body while they could without making too much fuss.
Well, thank you very much, Father. I suppose
well, thank you.
Can end in that note, and we hope to visit with you the shrine of St. Cuthbert soon.
That would be lovely.
Joining us.
That would be thrilling. Yes, we would have a little visit all together, but when all these regulations are removed.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Thank you for an interesting set of questions from a lot of people. Very interesting evening. So thank you all.
Thanks, Father Henry. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Nicholas.
I recorded the meeting to share with those that couldn't come today. So if it's okay with you, I'll share it with the others.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you, everyone, and good night. Thank you very much, Father.
Good night to you.
Good evening. Bye-bye. Thank you,
Bye.
everyone.
Bye.
God bless you.
God bless. Thank you. Good night. Well, there we go. It was a success, Father. Thank you
Well, I
very much.
think so. Thank you very much.
I did enjoy it,
A
Father.
nice lot of people, interesting questions.
Yes.
Well done.
No, thank you. And some of them couldn't come, so I'm glad we could record it so I could share it with them.
But there are quite a few. There were quite a few people. Two who just popped up. I only had about 6 people on my screen. You obviously seem to have more.
Yes, I had around 10 or so, 11, I believe.
Good, good. Well, well done. Thank you for asking me, and thank you for sorting the whole thing out.
It was a pleasure, Father, and I hope to see you in person soon.
That would be terrific. Great.
Yeah. Well, good night, Father.
All right, then. Good night.
Take care. Bye-bye.